Hey students, we're going to do another crime lecture, late night dispatch from the vinyl attic. We're going to talk about white collar crime. And I wanted to talk about white collar crime because it's something we don't usually talk about. We have a focus on what we call street crime, and as we've been talking about, there's often a racial and class stereotype to that crime, and white collar crime shatters that. So if you remember from our previous discussion, there are four types of crime according to the FBI: violent crime, property crime, victimless crime, and white collar crime. And white collar crimes are crimes against institutions that are committed by some means of deception. The average white collar criminal is an adult male, adult white male who has a college education. Very different from our stereotype of street crime. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that because one of the reasons that white collar crime. So this is the starting point is why do we have this stereotype of crime that's a poor minority phenomena when, as we'll talk about, white collar crime actually costs us a lot more. And part of that is white collar crime is inherently complicated. You know, it's hard to understand something like tax fraud or predatory lending or regulation violation. These are things that often are very complicated. The average person doesn't really understand about insider trading, what it means to bundle mortgage derivatives and sell them on the off market. Like, you know, even if you have a master's in finance, it's still pretty confusing. Murdering someone is pretty easy to understand. Stabbing someone, stealing their car. So that's the stuff that makes it on the news. That's the stuff that makes it on the cop shows. We love the murders. Serial killers, love those serial killers. Somebody who commits tax fraud, not quite as sexy. So part of it is just the complexity of understanding white collar crime. But the other part of it is who the white collar criminals are. Street criminals are on the street. If you look at the FBI Uniform Crime Report, and this is something we get into in my 204 class, the official reporting mechanism of crime in America, there's a lot of car theft, there's a lot of rape and murder, zero white collar crimes, zero white collar crimes. And I asked an FBI agent this one time, why in the FBI Uniform Crime Report, the main thing that reports crime in America, why are there no white collar crimes? And he gave a very functionalist answer. He's like, those are the crimes that Americans care the most about. They don't care about price fixing. They care about having their home broken into. But someone from the conflict perspective might say, well, maybe you're just protecting the powerful elite who are committing the crimes that really hurt Americans and keeping the focus on poor brown and black people, those criminals, those usual suspects. They're murderers and rapists. And so he could have given a very conflict perspective that says, you know, these crimes are the crimes of the poor. And we want to keep the focus on the poor, on especially poor people who are black and brown, and keep the focus off the rich white people who are committing these crimes because they're the ones that sort of run the show. And so crimes on the bottom, not on the top, when in fact the crimes on the top are much more costly to us. So part of the issue is about why we have this sort of collective ignorance about white collar crime. And I want to talk a little bit about white collar crime. And one of the things I wanted to do at the beginning of this, before I kind of talk about some specific white collar crimes, is talk about gender in white collar crimes. Because we do see more female participation in white collar crime. And I want to explain why. Crimes overwhelmingly are committed by males. Murder, obviously rape, although women can be arrested for sexual assault. There are, you know, female gang members, but gang violence overwhelmingly is a male phenomenon. That ties in with how we define maleness as, you know, what it means to be a man, as we've discussed. But when we look at the data on who is arrested for white collar crimes, some interesting patterns emerge. And one of the reasons I like to do this is sort of one way to talk about some examples of white collar crime. So I'm just gonna give you some statistics here. This is based on the FBI data on who is arrested for these crimes. So, for example, tax fraud, lying to the IRS about your taxes, claiming deductions that aren't real, or not claiming income that you're supposed to claim. Of those arrested for tax fraud, you know, tax fraud, kind of get you in the middle of the night, tax fraud. 93% of those arrested for tax fraud are male. Lending and credit fraud, which includes banks violating some of the rules that banks are supposed to follow, but can also include using credit cards that don't belong to you. Because you know how that works. I mean, if somebody, this has happened to me. I got a call one time from the bank, and I'm like, uh-oh, why is the bank calling me? And they said, Dr. Blazak, are you in Colorado Springs at a Walmart going on a shopping spree? I'm like, no, I would never go to a Walmart in Colorado Springs. Somebody had swiped my debit card and was running it up at a Walmart. I didn't pay for any of that, right? The cost was taken up by the bank and then passed on to the consumer. Anyway, bank fraud, lending fraud, 81% male arrest. So we're getting a little bit more females. A lot of women work in banks. A lot of women have access to credit cards. Counterfeiting, using funny money. 76% of those who are arrested for counterfeiting are male. And then I was thinking about this one. So this is my male brain. I was like, well, women have better art skills and they can draw better pictures of Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Hamilton and their art skill. No, Randy. Counterfeiters overwhelmingly male, and they will give the money to their female partners, their girlfriends, to introduce it to go buy something with some fake $100 bills. And so if somebody's like, this money's fake, they can be like, oh, I didn't know. And there's less suspicion that they're actually engaged in crime. They can just sort of play dumb. So that explains the 24% female arrest in counterfeiting. Regulatory offenses, we've talked about this one. There are laws that prevent you from dumping toxic waste in the Willamette River. I think that's a good thing. Sometimes I swim in the Willamette River. You want to make sure that you're not going to get cancer from swimming in the Willamette River. But people do it because it costs money to properly dispose of toxic waste. And so sometimes people break the rules on regulatory, whether it's safety regulations or environmental regulations or health regulations, putting stuff in food that's not supposed to be there. 90% of regulatory offenders are male. Forgery, signing your name to contracts, 70% male. Now, this is an interesting one because forgery can also include signing your names to checks that aren't yours. And even though things have changed with the sort of e-money that we use now, the number one reason women are in prison, besides some type of probation violation, is writing bad checks. That's the number one reason women go to prison. More than drugs, it's writing bad checks. That's probably changed a little bit since our sort of, way of paying for things has changed. Who writes checks anymore? But here's the one. This is the classic white-collar crime. Anytime we have a lesson on, white-collar crime 101, the one crime that everybody starts talking about is embezzlement. Stealing from the place that you work at. So embezzlement, can be doing some creative accounting. If I work at a bank and I set up a mechanism by which every time someone who goes to my bank uses their debit card, there's a 1% service charge on that transaction, and it goes into my private bank account in Switzerland. I can make millions of dollars, right? I can make a lot of money off of that. I'm stealing from the place that I work from. But it can also be stealing stuff. If I am at PCC and I take home a bunch of copy paper, not that I would ever do that, but if I were to take a bunch of copy paper home, I'm stealing from my workplace instead of buying it at the store. I'm just stealing it from work. That's also embezzlement. When we look at the numbers for embezzlement, only 59% of those who are arrested for embezzlement are male. 41% are female. Now, it's not 50-50, but it's pretty darn close in the world of crime. And so we have to ask the question, why is there such a high rate of female embezzlement? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. One is embezzlement can be, cooking the books at a firm, some big corporation that you work at and stealing the money. But embezzlement can just be taking material. So let's say I work in retail and I just, I'm working in a dress shop and I take a couple dresses home. So that's also embezzlement. Women also have access to money in a lot of the retail sector, working in front of the cash register, literally, or being the accountant. So women have a certain amount of access to the books, and so there's access. But what this really shows us is that the arrests reflect not the people at the top who commit the crimes, but the people at the bottom. So I'll give you a parallel example. When we look at tax fraud, the profession that is most likely to be audited by the IRS is not CEO of a corporation, not being some corporate bigwig or president of the United States who has pretended for 7 years now that he's being audited. When is that audit ever going to be done, Donald? The profession that's most likely to be audited by the IRS are servers, waitresses especially, because, they get tips, right? Tips are income. They don't always get declared when it comes time to do your taxes. And so the IRS comes down heavy on those folks. They might find some fraud, a little bit of money on someone who didn't declare, $500 in tips. They don't go after the top. So the data really reflects the fact that people at the bottom, even when it comes to white-collar crime, are more targeted for arrests than the people at the top. What we know is that white-collar crimes cost us a lot more money. And it's really hard to calculate costs because costs of white-collar crimes can include not just the money that is stolen, but also people feeling not secure about the bank, not secure about certain companies safely using their money. There are all kinds of sort of ripple effects of white-collar crime, but there was a study that was done earlier this year that looked at this issue. And what this study found was, when you look at street crime victimization, what it costs people, including of lost money and hospital bills and lost work and sort of all that stuff that goes along with being mugged on a street corner, we're looking at about $833 billion a year. $833 billion a year. Now, white-collar crimes, there's a whole bunch of different white-collar crime. When we look at occupational theft, which is embezzlement, and employee fraud, people sort of ripping off their employer, that cost is $1.6 trillion. Over $800 billion for street crimes, but over $1.6 trillion just for embezzlement and employee fraud. I mean, it's just hugely costful to us. And the thing is, we don't notice it. When you're being ripped off by your insurance company, or when you are the victim of price fixing, you pay for it a little bit at a time. So you're not really noticing it the same way. One of the main ways that white-collar crime happens is because of something called deregulation. And deregulation is a popular subject, especially in a normal election year anyway. There's a group of people that want to deregulate capital. They want to take away the regulations that corporations have to follow. Those are safety regulations and health regulations and environmental regulations, because it's a burden, right? They have to pay the cost of making sure their smokestacks are reducing the amount of toxins they're putting in the environment, or they have to pay for safety training of their employees. It's money out of their pocket, so they don't like they don't like regulations, and they want to deregulate it. But what we know is, as soon as you deregulate, you do two things. You loosen the rules, and you loosen the enforcement of the rules. So there are fewer cops who are monitoring white-collar crime. And the thing about policing white-collar crime is it's a lot different than policing street crime. If I want to police street crime, I just go down to the neighborhood where the poor minority people live, and I ask someone to show me what's in their pocket, and then if I got any drugs, I arrest them. Or maybe if they don't have any drugs, I arrest them. Investigating white-collar crime takes a lot of manpower, a lot of energy. So what we know when deregulation happens is that white-collar crime goes up through the roof, and that cost ends up being passed on to us. So let me give you one example of how this works. There's one particular crime called price fixing. Price fixing, this is not a sexy crime, but it's very important. Price fixing, the other word for price fixing is collusion. That in a capitalist system, the way the system is supposed to work is that if you've got a product for sale on the market, a gallon of gas or a car or whatever, the best product at the lowest price wins, right? That's capitalism. That's how it's supposed to work. But what if the competitors get together and collude? And there was a big example of this in the 1980s of the gas companies, that the The big oil companies were engaged in what they were calling the gas wars. In the 1970s, I remember this as a kid, you'd have a gas station, gas station A would say, oh, 68 cents a gallon. So everybody would go to that gas station. And across the street, gas station B would say 66 cents a gallon. So everybody goes over to that gas station. They start making some money. And then the gas station A says 62 cents a gallon and a free car wash. So everybody goes, so they're competing against each other, and the companies are making less and less money because the price of their product goes down and down, which is the way it's supposed to be. I mean, I remember it used to be, if you fill up your car, you get a toy dinosaur. So the big four gas companies got together and like, what are we doing? We're bidding against each other. We're driving the price down. Let's set the price. Let's say, we don't go below $1 a gallon, and we have fixed the price. And then that's illegal. That's a violation of the economic laws of this country to do what's called price fixing. And because of that, people lost money, but they didn't know that they were being ripped off. This is every time they filled up their tank, they paid more money than they should. I just got a check in the mail this week for $97 because there was a class action suit against a gas station for doing this and ripping people off. And so there was a lawsuit, and we all got a little bit of money, which I'm going to spend on something healthy, I'm sure. But the thing is, when those people get busted, there are no people that get busted. The companies are found guilty of it, even though they're ripping off, in that case, $60 billion a year was being netted extra for gasoline at the pump. Nobody goes to jail. None of those gas executives went to jail. There's fines for the company, and typically the fines are less than the net gain of the crime, so it's actually rational to commit the crime, because if you do get caught, which is not likely, the punishment is going to be so minuscule, slap on the wrist, you're going to make bank anyway. But no actual people, since the company is guilty, no actual people go to jail. So what we know about white-collar criminals is very rarely are they caught. When they are caught, the penalties are much lighter. And if they do actually go to jail, it's a sort of a upper class jail. So some people might know the person Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart went to prison for insider trading. She's one of the few people that have been caught for insider trading, which is when you're trading your stocks and bonds on insider information that you're not supposed to. It's a violation of the rule. And she went to a place that everybody called Camp Cupcake because it was like a summer retreat and wasn't like going to San Quentin. So there is a double standard in the criminal justice system. How we treat street criminals. You got a little bit of weed in your pocket. Guess what? We're sending you to prison for 5 years, and life is gonna be hell because now you're a convicted drug felon. Or we take somebody who's kind of on the top of the economic ladder, and we let them slide. And they have great lawyers, and so if they do get caught, they're probably going to get away with it. And there are all kinds of examples of this, and very few people actually serve any time. So there's a real imbalance. So when people want to talk about crime, one of the things we can do to try to right the balance is say, okay, let's talk about white-collar crime. Let's talk about embezzlement. Let's talk about price fixing. Let's talk about insider trading. Let's talk about regulatory violation. Let's talk about predatory lending in the housing market. These are crimes that devastate people's lives, that ruin them financially, and in case of many occupational regulation violations, kill people. Close to 200,000 people a year killed because some CEO didn't follow the rules of safety regulations. So we're talking about crime that takes money out of people's pockets and takes lives, and is very rarely on the evening news because we got to get those guys down in the projects who are the criminals. So I just wanted to put sort of a real basic idea about white-collar crime out there in your head so you kind of understand how to judge it. I'll include a really good link about white-collar crime and the cost of it below. And then there's a question coming from that way or that way. And there you go. All right, tiny little mini lecture.